Thank you, Sid. Didn't they do good? Somebody go up to Sid later and tell them what a nice job they did. How many of us have ever read Goodnight Moon? How many of us have read Goodnight Moon, I don't know, 100 times? Several of us. How many have read Stuart Little? How many have read any part of the Cambridge Platform? So this morning I'm going to talk a little bit about Anne Carroll Moore, a librarian who had a significant impact on those children's books that I just mentioned and on many other books and authors. And then I'll talk a little about the Cambridge Platform, which describes how our Puritan ancestors did church in the 17th century. Essentially, the Cambridge Platform is sort of the DNA at the heart of congregational polity as it is practiced in our UU congregations today. And then I'll explore a little more how Miss Moore and our Puritan forebears exemplify both the most helpful and the most challenging parts of our Unitarian Universalist tradition and human life in general. Anne Carroll Moore basically invented the children's library. When she was born in 1871, the concept of a publicly funded city library was still scarcely a generation old. In the late 19th century, a library patron had to be 14 years old and a boy to borrow a book. Some places you had to be 16. And the librarians would still shush you anytime you spoke and mock you for your trashy taste in books if you were reading some of that Walter Scott or James Fenimore Cooper or Charles Dickens. Miss Moore and other librarians began to discuss reserving some corner of the library exclusively for books written for children. In 1906, Moore was hired as the director of work with children at the New York Public Library. She quickly lobbied for and won borrowing privileges for boys and girls. When the library opened its iconic main branch there at the corner of 42nd Street and 5th Avenue, the one with the lions, it included a dedicated reading room for children. There were child-sized tables and child-sized chairs. There were fresh flowers, and there were books, thousands of books, none of them locked away for adults, but on display for children to read and touch and borrow and take home. There were no signs that ordered silence, and there were even scheduled story hours so kids could hear stories as well as read them. By 1913, children's books accounted for over 1/3 of the books loaned out of the library's branch system. Similar children's libraries sprang up all over the country. Moore published lists of her favorite books, and librarians stocked everything she suggested. She also published reviews of children's books, rather children's literature, as it was finally being acknowledged. Moore helped demonstrate that books like The Velveteen Rabbit, Winnie the Pooh, and the works of Beatrix Potter were in fact art. Anne Carroll Moore also helped create prizes for children's literature, including the prestigious Newbery Medal. Anybody thinking there's a twist about to come up here? You see, while Miss Moore essentially created children's libraries and championed many marvelous works of children's literature, she did not like all children's stories. She generally approved of books that were sentimental, precious, and involved talking animals. From our vantage point almost a century later, it appears that she preferred books that offered escape. All of which is fine, right? I sometimes read as an escape. Except Anne Carroll Moore would not include any books that did not offer escape on her lists that so many libraries used to fill their shelves. Publishing companies would send her review copies, and she could make or destroy the career of authors she reviewed. A perhaps apocryphal tale was that she had a stamp on her desk which read, "Not recommended for purchase by expert." Whether or not she actually had that stamp, Miss Moore did have a huge impact on the stories that were being published. When she got a copy of Goodnight Moon, she hated it. There was no fantasy, no escape, no talking animals, just a child interacting with their surroundings. Which was, by the way, exactly the point of the book. By 1947, there were many librarians and authors who thought it beneficial for children to read stories that took place in settings and situations similar to their own. Not according to Anne Carroll Moore. She excoriated Goodnight Moon and prevented it from getting much of a place on any library shelves anywhere. A few years later, Moore also criticized Stuart Little, keeping it off most shelves. She used her influence to keep Stuart Little off of the Newbery Medal list, not even mentioned in the runners-up. Goodnight Moon and Stuart Little went on to become giants in children's literature. I'll bet it was hard for Ms. Moore to watch as these books climbed the sales lists. We know it was hard for her to let go of the power that she once had. Even after she had retired, she attended all the meetings that she had once chaired. She even attended them when the new director changed the venue so she couldn't find them. She was officially retired when she squashed, albeit temporarily, Goodnight Moon and Stuart Little. And as I listened to the story of Anne Carroll Moore on a recent 99% Invisible podcast, I felt a great deal of sympathy for her. I thought, this woman needed better friends. She needed people who would tell her the uncomfortable truth and help keep her grounded. And that's when I thought of the Cambridge platform, as I'm sure you all have as well. When our Puritan forebears reached the shores of this continent, they organized their churches to be as close as possible to the way they understood the Christian scriptures. Neither the Gospels nor any books by or about Paul mention extra-church hierarchies. There are no popes in the Bible, there are no bishops, there are only congregations making decisions for themselves. So that's how they organized their churches in and around the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, they did realize that they were dealing with human beings. They knew they would need some kind of structure for accountability. Rather than using bishops or popes, they mandated the use of other local congregations. If a congregation was beginning to sin, if a preacher was leading his flock astray, and it was always his those days, then the other nearby congregations would call a council and invite their errant friends and get everyone back on the straight and narrow. When I learned about the Cambridge platform in seminary, I thought those councils could solve most of our problems. Racism, sexism, transphobia. Our UUA in Boston can only offer suggestions and provide workshops. A local council could meet and tell a misguided congregation that they were straying. They could offer guidance, support, and a measure of accountability. Just like Anne Carroll Moore needed good friends to give her feedback and keep her grounded, so do our congregations need good relationships with other nearby congregations. I've thought that for about 20 years now. But rereading the Cambridge platform recently made me reconsider. The authors of the Cambridge platform refer to themselves as saints. They had all experienced powerful religious conversions. They knew they were saved. When they wrote about councils, they meant if they saw other congregations beginning to sin, it was their duty, their sacred obligation to save their friends from an eternity in hell. They did not imagine such a council might be called to bring them back into right relationship. Ms. Moore knew she was right about children's literature. The Puritans knew they were the righteous of the earth. And I know that other silly, wrong-headed singer is feeling when I'm upset with them. As long as we think that we are right and those other people are the ones that need work, we're not going to be successful in our attempts to get them to change. And worse, we'll miss many opportunities to grow and evolve ourselves. I still think the idea of a friend group is a good one. I think councils of local congregations could probably be useful. I feel like it's important that all of those groups begin in humility. Speaking only for myself, if I join a group and say explicitly, I'm imperfect, I am a work in progress, and I am imperfect and a work in progress. And if I tell them I welcome feedback, both challenge and support, I think that will be more successful. And if similar groups of imperfect, evolving, collaborating people from nearby congregations all meet to offer another level of feedback and grounding, I think we might be on to something. In the congregation where I served as intern minister, the UU Society of Geneva, Illinois, their covenant includes the line, "We have associated ourselves together not as agreeing in opinion, not as having attained universal truth in belief or perfection in character, but as seekers after truth and goodness." I love that they remind themselves every week they're imperfect and still evolving. Anne Carroll Moore revolutionized libraries and changed the lives of innumerable children, many of us in this room. The ideas of congregational polity written into the Cambridge platform have created the platform from which many social problems have been addressed through our congregations. None of them were perfect. Despite their own unquestioned conclusions, they had not achieved universal truth nor perfection in character. And as I'm standing here judging them, I know I must also call out similar blind spots in my own life. I know that I've made some decisions. I know that I've said things to people that I regret, that I've tried to work out and make better. I know there are some that I don't recognize, that I'm in blissful ignorance of. So I leave us with the question, how are we curating our own experience? What are we not questioning about our own beliefs and actions? In what situations are we certain that somebody else is wrong? And what might we gain if we take another look at that relationship and reconsider if we might be misunderstanding something? How might we join or form groups that would better ground us and provide venues for greater change or deeper evolution? So may we live our questions. So may we be.